but this session is our last session and very important one. So our final session of the day, we will discuss assisted reproductive technologies. We have three presenters with us, and I'll now invite Professor Anna Rikert, Population Research Institute Vastuito, the Family Federation of Finland, to moderate the discussion.
Yes, welcome back from the coffee, everybody. In this last session, we will approach one subject which hasn't really been raised. It's related to bodies and to how to make babies. And here we will focus on how technology can interact with different kinds of human bodies to produce babies. And I look really forward to this session because it comes so close to the skin to many of us. Many of us have experiences of using assisted reproductive technologies, or we certainly all know somebody who has had experiences of this, resulting in a child or not. And I welcome our, again, really global and broad panel. We are all familiar with the time schedules of these sessions. And first to speak is Jasmin Passet-Wittig, sitting here. You are from Germany, from the Federal Institute for Population Research.
Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here at this symposium and speak about this important topic. So in my talk, I will be speaking about ART policies in high-income countries and share with you my thoughts on some best practices and policy reflections. Let me start with some introductory words on the context against the backdrop against which we're discussing this topic here. I mean, and of course, it's that of low fertility and fertility impoundment, which is associated with the risk, increasing risk of experiencing fertility problems. And this may result, particularly among the older women or couples, in a gap between the fertility intentions, desires, and the number of children that they have. And the important thing here is that this is associated on the individual level with a lot of stress and pressure. So when we speak, when I will be speaking about regulation, I want to distinguish three areas of this regulation. The first is the methods which are allowed in a country or not. The second is who has access to these treatments, and the third is who is eligible for reimbursement, so for public funding. And of course, these three areas are interconnected. So just for an example, I mean, if in a country surrogacy is not allowed, then you exclude same-sex male couples from treatment. And there are many more examples where it is quite obvious how these three areas of regulation are very much interrelated. And what we see in globally, but let me focus a little bit here on Europe, is a large variation in policies. There are many stakeholders involved, many, not only financial, but social, cultural, religious, ethical considerations are made and are heard from different parties. So, and it's a complex, so the result is a complex, iterative social and political negotiation process. And the result, obviously, then is some sort of compromise, which is not always the best solution for, let's say, for the side of the patients. So here are some examples of ART policy approaches in high-income countries. The first is a comprehensive coverage, and examples for that are Belgium or France, where access is almost universal with general public funding. Then there are other countries such as Germany or Japan who have selective coverage. They are more restrictive in many ways by limiting access and also limiting public funding based on medical and social criteria. And then there's yet another approach. I mean, this list is not exhaustive, but that's the more market-driven approach, such as it used in the US, with minimal public funding and high private sector involvement. So I was asked also to think about best practices. And then when you think about best practices, the question is from what perspective? I've been thinking about it, and for me, the most important perspective is that of the potential users, so to say, the potential patients, in a way. So, and what is needed is affordability, because these treatments are expensive, and accessibility for those in need of services. Equity and inclusivity in the financial assistance are important, because there's a lot of criteria that are not medical that some regulations impose, such as age or marital status. So, for example, in Japan and in Germany, reimbursement of treatment cost is only available for married couples, or mainly for married couples. Also, patients need easy to understand information, and they should have access to psychological support. We need to ensure the rights of the parties involved. We need ethical oversight, ensuring patient safety in a situation where there's where the medical it's evolving, and there's lots of new methods and procedures, and a balancing, of course, of innovation and safety. I'm coming close to the end, so this is my last slide. So my three main messages, I guess, are that we should consider ART as a tool mainly to support those who are in need of assistance to realize their reproductive goals. And I mean, to speak frankly, not as a tool for increasing the number of births. And so to say, I want to see ART policy as part of a more holistic approach to reproductive health, complementing other policies. And by that, I mean family supportive policies that address the underlying causes of fertility postponement. And of course, another thing that we need is fertility education to help people make informed choices to the extent that that is possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jasmin. This was a very good introduction to the topic. Thank you so much. And then next we have Ester Lazzari, who's a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Vienna.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I would like to start my talk by explaining what is the rationale behind the policy supporting assisted reproductive technologies, or ART. And we can see this rationale well summarized in this figure, which shows the dramatic increase in the mean age at birth over the past few decades in different parts of Europe, North America, East Asia, and the Pacific. This trend is mostly driven by women postponing their first birth. So women are delaying the age at which they start forming a family. And this is also reflected in many surveys, which shows that the intention to have a child at advanced reproductive ages has increased. However, we know that at older ages, reproductive capacity is lower. Infertility is a medical condition that has affected populations throughout history, even at times when fertility rates were much higher and people were having children at a younger age. However, the prevalence of infertility increases with age, and because of this trend that we're seeing here of delaying fertility, much more people are experiencing infertility in the population compared to the past. And so infertility has likely become an increasingly relevant barrier for women and couples to achieve their reproductive plans. And so today, never as much as today, people are in need of assisted reproductive technologies to fulfill their childbearing aspirations. The contribution of ART to the total fertility rate has been estimated by a handful of studies conducted in specific countries. And these studies have estimated that ART can increase the TFR by between 1% and 7%. For example, in the US, ART contributed to 1.3% of the TFR in 2020, almost 3% in the UK in 2018. In Japan, it was almost 7% and slightly above 5% in Australia in 2017. And this variation that we can see across countries is partly the result of different access to ART treatments. And this is referencing a bit to what Jasmin was talking about before. For example, the US and Australia can be considered two opposite cases. In the US, access to ART is minimal because there is no public funding for ART treatments, and treatments are expensive even with insurance coverage. On the other hand, we have a country like Australia, which offers comprehensive access to ART. The government is very supportive, and there are no restrictions based on the woman's age or on the number of children she already has, and or on the number of ART treatments that she can have. The UK and Japan sit somewhere in the middle because they have limitations regarding the age to access treatment and also the number of treatments provided. But Japan provides a much more support compared to the UK. To really understand the demographic impact of ART and how much it can really support fertility rates, it is very important to look at its age-specific contribution. In this study, we used Australian data. Australia is an interesting case study because, as I was saying before, there are no limits on the age for accessing treatments. And so we can really see what's the contribution of ART to fertility recovery at older ages. And we found out that 1 in 10 babies born to women aged 35 to 39 was the result of ART. 1 in 5 babies born to women 4 to 44, and 1 in 3 babies born to women age 45 and above. So we can really see how relevant of a role ART can play in supporting fertility plans of women at advanced reproductive ages. It is also interesting to know that the contribution of ART is mostly concentrated on first births. So it's mostly helping women to have their first child rather than higher order births. And so the contribution is mostly concentrated in reducing involuntarily childlessness rather than further increasing family size. However, the success rates of ART, it's relatively low. Most treatments are actually unsuccessful, and things tend to get worse with age. For example, the success rate is about 30% for women aged 18 to 34, but it declines to less than 5% for women aged 45 to 50. And this is due to the decline in egg quality with age. And there is really no solution at the moment for this age-related decline in egg quality. However, we know that the uterus can function for much longer after the eggs cannot be fertilized anymore. And so for older women, a more effective solution at these older ages is to rely on treatments that use younger eggs provided by a younger donor, or eggs that have been previously frozen by the woman when she was younger. And we can see indeed on the right panel that the success rates when using treatments that rely on donor eggs is much higher like it's comparable to the success rates of women at younger ages using own eggs. And we don't really see any pattern by age. So it doesn't really vary by age. And we estimated that the contribution of donor eggs to fertility rates by age in the UK, and found that at age 43 and above, indeed, over 90% of ART conceived births were the result of treatments using donor eggs.
30 seconds.
So overall, we found that ART has a small but important contribution to the TFR. It is between 5 and 7% in countries with a supportive funding system. And this is really similar to other fertility policies that we have discussed over these past 2 days. However, supporting ART may be particularly meaningful in the context of delayed childbearing, because this is the only policy that specifically targets the age-related decline in fecundity. So all the other policies that we have discussed today and yesterday assume that people have the biological capacity to have a child, but they are not having a child because of other external constraints. And so they are really irrelevant for all these couples that arrive at the decision that they want a child, but they cannot because they have infertility. At the same time, treatment rates are not always successful. The majority of people using treatments want to have a child as a result of ART. And so it is also important that the government does not oversell ART as a cure-all technology, but that support for ART is done in a context where individuals know about their opportunities and about the chances of having a child with and without ART. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ester. This was a very good overview, both of the promises and the perils of relying on ART. And then next, we have Mijeom, I hope I pronounced it right, who is the team lead from the Seoul Metropolitan Government. Yes, please.
안녕하세요. 저는 서울시청에서 건강임신지원팀장으로 근무하고 있는 이미정입니다. 저출산 대응책을 논하는 자리에서 함께 하게 되어 정말 영광으로 생각합니다. 제가 감기가 걸려서 목소리가 좋지 않은데 동시통역사가 있어서 정말 다행입니다. 잘 부탁드립니다. 서울시는 2022년에 저출산 위기 대응으로 탄생 응원 프로젝트를 계획하고 2023년부터 난임 부부 시술 지원 정책을 첫 신호탄으로 본격적인 대응을 하고 있습니다. 저는 오늘 서울시의 저출산 정책 중에서 난임 부부 시술비 지원 정책과 난자 동결 시술비 지원 사업을 발표하고자 합니다. 먼저 서울시의 출산 환경을 10년 전과 10년 후를 비교해 보면 드라마틱하게 변화하고 있습니다. 즉, 저출산 위기임을 분명하게 보여주고 있습니다. 서울시의 가임 여성 인구는 10년 전에 비해 약 5%가 감소되었지만은 학기 출산율은 0.97에서 0.5로 약 절반이 감소되었습니다. 많은 이유로 결혼을 하지 않거나 못하는 경우도 있겠지만 결혼 연령도 10년간 남녀 모두 평균이 2살 정도로 높아졌음을 알 수 있습니다. 가임 여성 인구는 줄고 있지만 결혼 연령이 높아짐에 따라 가임 인구는 해마다 늘어나고 나임 시술로 태어나는 아기도 해마다 증가하고 있습니다. 그래프를 보시면 10년 동안 평균 결혼 연령이 2년 높아짐으로 인해서 출산 연령도 약 2년이 높아졌습니다. 여성의 임신 가능 나이는 보통 15세에서 49세까지 보고 있습니다. 혼인 연령의 증가는 여성의 임신 가능 기간이 짧아지고 임신 가능성도 낮아지고 높은 나이의 임신은 난임과 고위험 임신으로 이어집니다. 서울시에서는 2006년부터 난임 부부 시술비 지원을 시작하였고 국가건강보험 급여 적용은 2017년부터 시작되었습니다. 2023년도에는 난임 부부 시술비 지원 조건을 대폭 확대하여 소득에 관계없이 아이 갖기를 희망하는 모든 난임 부부에게 시술비를 지원하고 시술별로 제한했던 횟수 칸막이도 없앴습니다. 24년 현재 서울시 난임부부 시술비 지원 횟수는 시술별 칸막이 없이 총 25회까지 지원하고 있으며 지원 금액은 시술별로 110만 원에서 30만 원까지 지원하고 있습니다. 그동안 공난포와 같이 여러 이유로 난임 시술이 중단되었을 때 지원을 하지 못하다가 올해 11월 1일부터는 횟수에 제한 없이 지원하게 되었습니다. 자, 다음 표를 보시면 매년 난임 진단자 수도 증가하고 있으며 시술비 지원 횟수도 큰 폭으로 증가하여 올해 10월 달까지 약 4만 3천 건을 지원하였습니다. 그중에 체육 수정이 86%이고 인공 수정은 14%입니다. 사업 예산도 5년간 4.5배가 증가하여 24년도 서울시 난임 시술비 지원 예산은 461억에 달합니다. 그렇다면 난임 시술로 얼마나 많은 아기가 태어났을까요? 올해 지난달까지 서울시 전체 출생아는 35,600여 명입니다. 그중에 5,700여 명이 난임 시술로 태어난 것으로 조사되었습니다. 약 16%를 차지하며 출생아 6명 중에 1명이 난임 시술로 태어난 것입니다. 아기 낳기를 희망하는 난임 부부에게 경제적으로 어려움이 없도록 시술비를 지원하여 저출생 문제를 해결해 나가는 난임 정책은 비용 대비 효율이 높은 지원책이라고 생각합니다. 다음은 서울시 난자 동결 시술비 지원 정책입니다. 죄송합니다. 물 좀 감기에 걸려서 제가 입이 계속 마르고 그런데 물 좀.
Sure. Of course.
서울시는 전국 최초로 지난해 9월부터 난자 동결 지원 사업을 시행하였습니다. 난자 동결은 여성의 난자를 미리 동결 보존하여 미래에 원하는 시기에 임신을 할 수 있도록 지원하는 사업입니다. 난자 동결을 희망하는 20대, 30대, 40대 모든 여성에게 지원하고 있습니다. 단 20대 여성은 난소 호르몬 수치가 3.5 이하로 낮거나 임신에 영향을 미치는 질환이 있을 경우에만 지원이 됩니다. 난자 동결 시술비는 비보험으로 300만 원에서 500만 원 정도의 높은 비용이 들어갑니다. 서울시는 총 시술비의 50%, 최대 200만 원까지 1회 지원하고 있습니다. 23년 9월부터 올해 10월까지 약 1년 2개월 동안 947명에게 지원하였습니다. 난자 동결 시술비를 지원받은 여성은 30대가 655명으로 69%이며 난소 호르몬 수치가 3.5 이하, 즉 평균 이하인 여성이 77%로 난임을 걱정하고 있는 여성이 난자 동결을 희망하고 있음을 알 수 있습니다. 늦은 결혼과 학업으로 난자 동결을 희망하는 여성은 계속 증가될 것으로 예상합니다. 난자 동결을 했다가 해동하여 임신을 시도한 경우 냉동 난자 보조 생식수를 서울시에서는 지원하고 있는데요. 올해 서울시에서 33명이 냉동 난자로 임신을 시도하였습니다. 앞으로도 계속 증가할 거로 예상되고 있습니다. 이상으로 보고를 마치겠습니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you so much for this interesting insight into the relevance of ART for the fertility of this city and its citizens. Now we have two commentary speeches. The first one is by Mr. Gitau Mburu from the World Health Organization. You're welcome.
Thanks very much indeed for the invitation to participate in this session. We would like to thank UNFPA and KOSTAT for the opportunity. Thanks also to the presenters who have provided very insightful presentations on the issue of the role of ART in terms of responding to fertility declining fertility rates. In 2023, the World Health Organization launched global estimates of infertility, which was the first time in over 10 years that WHO had done that. And we found that the 17.5% of people will experience infertility at one point in their lifetime. At any one point, 12.6% of people will have infertility. The definition of infertility is a bit narrow, and it is the inability to conceive after 12 months of unprotected sexual intercourse. And this really means that the way that it's been proposed is very clinical. But we know that infertility or inability to have children is not just a clinical condition, it can also be because of social reasons. In 2009, WHO reclassified infertility from a condition to a disease. And this was really for the first time that infertility was included in the International Classification of Diseases. The reason for that was to enable countries, insurance companies, and other stakeholders to include infertility within benefits systems and to actually provide funding for infertility as a medical condition. In 2012, 48.5 million people were estimated to have infertility. And of course, this is distinct from just childlessness or voluntary childlessness. Access to healthcare is important for us at WHO. And the primary concern is to make sure that everybody has the highest standard of physical, mental, and of course, social well-being. Currently, WHO is developing guidelines for the diagnosis, prevention, and treatment of infertility, and we are expecting this to be published in 2025. We have seen globally increasing numbers of countries requesting, numbers of member states or countries requesting WHO to provide some guideline recommendations for how infertility as a disease should be treated. This is because many countries do not actually have their own national guidelines for responding and treating or preventing or diagnosing infertility. So the big question now is, which is I think the purpose of this session was, should ART be included as part of the policy mix for responding to declining fertility rates? And the short answer from our perspective is that it should be yes. However, provision of ART should obviously be within a rights-based approach, which is geared towards protecting, promoting, and providing sexual and reproductive health services to enable people to actually achieve their reproductive goals. Again, to emphasize that the primary goal of responding to ART and providing ART should not really be driven by the need to increase TFR. In addition, of course, we also know that ART can have differentiated impacts. What we have seen from one of the presentations here is that the range from the data that we have, the range of increases in from ART can range anywhere between 0. In many countries, it's really non-existent. In most countries, it's between 2 and 5%. In very few countries, it will be 8, very isolated countries up to 9%, especially in Europe. So ART can have differentiated impacts, and we cannot assume that just because it's doing very well in Australia, where the level and skills and training and facilities are high and top-notch, it will be the same impact in another country. In addition, ART cannot really fully compensate for postponement of births. So this needs to be very clear. We can achieve modest increases from ART, but you cannot really compensate fully. Providing ART should be viewed as a right, and we need to make sure that we are also enhancing efforts to increase awareness around fertility decline, number one, and number two, also increasing awareness that ART has limits. The reason I say number one in terms of just declines in fertility rate is because in some of the studies we have seen, mostly from Nordic countries, awareness is very low about the decline after the age of 35 or age of 38. People don't really know that. Those who are in countries such as Korea may know, but in most other countries they don't know. Number two, I think, has also been presented in by one of the speakers. There is a risk of creating an impression that ART will solve your problems later. Even if you froze your eggs, the chances of conceiving from ART is not 100%. In fact, you can freeze as many many eggs, but you really have 25%, 30% chance of getting getting a live birth. So really, just to conclude, I just want to conclude on the determinants of what sort of factors determine the success of ART. One of them is availability, access, and utilization. And for this, we know that financing is important. Number two is, of course, effectiveness and effectiveness of ART. Number three, we know that the eligibility criteria, and this differs in many countries. In some countries, at least for now, what we know is that about half of the countries limit eligibility by people who are in established heterosexual relationships. And of course, the older you get, the less likely that you're going to be successful. So to respond very quickly to the presentation that have been made, really first is to just congratulate Ester because of the work that you've done around projecting potential future impact. This is not something that's been done very regularly. And I think in terms of the graph that you showed that we saw from the graphs, from the slides that you presented, that about 4 countries, UK, Japan, US, and I think Australia, have relatively good data on impact of ART. But we know from globally that just 10 countries account for nearly 90% of ART around the world. There is a huge amount of inequality in terms of success. So maybe, Esther, you can respond by indicating what you think about ways in which we can increase access to ART for other countries, because that really is where the problem is. And the second question is to Mijeom, who presented some very interesting data. We don't in many countries see rates of 200% increase of use of IVF. And I wondered whether this is because there is more intensive case finding, or whether there has been expansion of IVF clinics. It would be good to know why this is happening in Korea. And finally, to Jasmin, I think you've given a very good overview of some of the best practices, but I wondered whether you might be able to say something about whether regulation of ART should also be considered as one of the best practices, and what you could say about that. Thanks very much indeed, and sorry for running a bit over.
No, thank you. It's fine. Thank you, Dr. Mburu, for very comprehensive, global, and I think important points, not least about the very differential access to these treatments. And then last but not least, we have Lucy van de Wiel from King's College, London.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you everyone for being here, for being awake. Thank you especially, Elizabeth, for inviting all of us and organizing all of this and the whole team. I think, having listened to this, all the beautiful talks over the last 2 days, one other term that I'd like to introduce is to think about reproductive justice as a term to organize a lot of the things that we talk about. So this is a term that was introduced by the Black feminist movement in the US, and really brings together a number of different issues to consider. So the right to have children for those who want them, the right not to have children, as well as the right to raise the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And to really think about all those different issues together rather than focusing only on one of them. And that may be at the heart of what we want to do and communicate here today. So going over all those three, if you look at the right to have children, ARTs can play a role in that. it's important to look at indeed who has access, but also what does the access communicate? What does government support communicate exactly? So responding to Jasmin's presentation, you mentioned fertility education is important. And I agree that it's important that people are educated, but also we have to see that a lot of the fertility education initiatives are often really overlapping with fertility marketing. So here in Seoul, for example, recently there was an egg freezing pop-up store with a banner that was 4 stories high, and people could sort of test their fertility and get information about it. But there is often a very fine line in this field, which is often highly commercialized, to make a decision about what is real education and when do we talk about marketing of treatments that may or may not be in people's best interest. So it's lovely that the Korean government now partly subsidizes egg freezing and IVF. It's also important to keep in mind when we look at egg freezing, what it actually does. So it doesn't always translate into a lot of babies, because we see that only so far about 10% of women return to use the eggs, and most women don't return to use the eggs. They might have children in another way or decide not to use the eggs for other reasons. And then there's the success rate associated with it is, you know, if you're lucky, about 20%, but it may be a lot lower depending on when you freeze your eggs and what quality they are. So there's maybe not that many babies, but that doesn't mean it's not important. It can be important for women to feel that they have a way of dealing with the very conflict that we've been talking about, the conflict about whether or not to have children under certain circumstances in relation to a variety of norms that can be really challenging. And also to deal with what I think Thomas mentioned before about reproductive ambivalence, and maybe some people are very sure they want to have children, but many people are like torn in many different directions, and egg freezing can be one way of dealing with that ambivalence. In Ester's talk, you mentioned, you showed the 2 graphs with the stark difference between using your own eggs and donor eggs or frozen earlier eggs. And I think what we have to understand behind the graph of the donor eggs are the egg donors. And there's some really interesting research for people who are interested in egg donation to see what happens to egg donors themselves. It can be the case that it can be a good opportunity for people to donate their eggs, but realize that it is quite an invasive procedure, and there isn't that much research on the long-term health effects when very young women go through these procedures, especially if they do that for the compensation rather than doing it for their own reproductive goals. So an amazing book has just come out by Diane Tauber, and she has chronicled the stories of over 100 women who've donated their eggs, some with really serious health concerns. So before we consider egg donation as the solution, let's think about the egg donors. In Korea, there has been a scandal before about egg donation, and now the National Korean Bioethics Committee has really limited egg donation for research purposes, and now uses a lot of frozen eggs for research purposes. So that's a really interesting development, and goes back to the idea of egg freezing and what happens to the 90% of eggs that won't be picked up. One other interesting thing that I found in your presentation, Mijeom, is that the diagnoses that we saw, the numbers for male infertility and female infertility, showed about 2/3 female infertility and 1/3 male infertility. But we know from research that it's about half and half, or in fact, 1/3 we don't know, 1/3 male factor, 1/3 female factor. So if we do see that there's double the amount of female infertility diagnoses, there may be a lot of undiagnosed male infertility that you may want to have a look at. And that may be playing back into the previous session, the gender norms about what gets addressed and what doesn't. Right, so some more other things. People who want to have children, it may be good to also look at other people besides married heterosexual people, including LGBT parents or LGBT intended people. In Korea, there's now no access for lesbians to access IVF, and also adoption for LGBT couples is not available. So we may need to look at other types of reproduction that may be relevant as well. And that's linked to issues of marriage and civil union recognition as well, including its implications for health insurance and so on. And then if we look at reproductive justice, we're also looking at the right not to have children. So we have now the decriminalization of abortion in Korea since 2021, if I understand correctly. But at the same time, there's not a lot of clarity about what's happening with this law exactly. So it's important for people to have access to abortion, contraception, and other means to decide when they want to have children, not just having children as such. And we see this, it was mentioned before earlier, in the 4B movement as well, in the backlash that we see among women's movements, where they feel, I'm rounding it up, yeah, where there can be a response to the more pronatalist policies that they feel like this is pressuring us in the wrong direction and we don't want to participate in this. So whatever comes out of this, the government policies and so on, we have to also think about how do people feel about these policies and do they feel valued for their possibilities beyond having children. So if I just have to round it off now, I think when we look at this meeting, we can think about, gosh, we've all come together from all over the world. There's so many influential voices here. So many institutions represented, so much CO2 being produced, so much money is created in this room and brought together in this room. So what can we do with that? What can we do with being here together? And I think one small point is that we can look into what exactly the issue is with low fertility. Are we really talking about taxation? Are we talking about care? Are we talking about social welfare? Are we talking about GDP? Which may all have different solutions, including issues about labor reform or migration or other things besides having babies. But also, and that will be my last point, is thinking about if low fertility has the political purchase at the moment, if low fertility is the issue that brings us all together and that has the possibility for government reform, maybe we can use that in order to achieve other goals. Maybe we can use that in order to achieve broader gender equality, broader, what Thomas was talking about, reproductive empowerment, broader ideas of reproductive justice that maybe are not at the top of the political agenda, but that we can bring to the top of the political agenda via the issue of low fertility. So let's see what we can do together in order to make that happen.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I really hate to be the one who needs to stop you talking, but now the time limit, you were all wonderful in time. I thank you for, I think, your last, this talk and the concept of reproductive justice brought together all these complex, many-leveled threads and set the topic. Now, I would invite you firstly to respond to the questions. You can respond to the ones you wish to have now. And I mean, also feel free to comment between you. I have questions for you too, but let's get the panel going. And those of you sitting being really tired, feel free to stand up. It's okay with me. I'm from the Free Nordics. You can move. And yeah, I see somebody there because, I mean, we know you listen anyway. Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank
Who
you
wants to start?
very much for the for your comments. I would first like to comment on what you said regarding ART regulation as part of best practices. And as I understand the question, there are countries that don't have. There are quite some countries that don't have don't have a good regulation or outdated regulation. And just from the German case, we see that how difficult it is to have these negotiations and in the government to update the regulation. I mean, we have a law enacted that's from the 1990s, and so a lot has happened since then. And we're having gaps. We're having treatments that are not regulated at all, leaving it to the medical practitioners to make choices. And there are probably other and more extreme examples of that. And then, yes, there's Lucy, you spoke about the overlap of fertility education with with fertility marketing. And yes, I totally agree that that can be an issue, and it can be a very problematic issue. But there are also examples of good ways to inform to inform people. I think in the UK case, there is. I forget the name of the association. I can look it up, but that make quite an effort to provide guidance also on these add-ons that are available on the market, of which we know most of them are not helping couples or people to get pregnant, and it's helps people to navigate this process. And so what we need is kind of independent education about late fertility, about fertility decline, about the limits of assisted reproductive technology. And just a more general comment on things that have been discussed is, and that I would like to mention, is that these treatments are associated with costs for the public healthcare system, but also, and this is something that we really need to consider from the patient perspective. It's of course, infertility is a serious threat to people's life goals, but then the treatment itself, it's associated with costs, with physical burden, with psychological burden. And it's against this backdrop that I am saying that it's problematic, and we really have to consider this when we speak about ART as a measure to increase fertility. Just so it's the patient perspective or the user perspective that we need to take here. I'm not saying we should not offer ART, but I'm just saying that it's a treatment for those who need it, and it can help, but it's not. I'll stay with that. Leave it with that.
Thank you so much. Who wants to go next? Maybe would you? Yep.
So thank you very much to the discussants for the insightful comments. I'd like to start by answering Lucy, and a little bit more about egg donation. So think about the donors. Yes, of course. And that is very much what I wanted to show with this slide, showing success rates and how they change by age. So usually people don't really want to use donor eggs. It is not even for the patient. I need a solution to go down that path, because everybody, of course, would prefer to use their own eggs and to have that genetic connection with their child. But at these later ages, it is really most of the time the only option that can give you some realistically high success rates. And so I think that it is really about our awareness of what these age limits are, and knowing your options. And perhaps egg freezing would give you a similar success rate if you just had the eggs frozen before. So this could be a more interesting solution, more like less ethically problematic solution compared to the use of donor eggs. And so far, not many people have gone back to use their eggs, but because the increase in egg freezing is really starting now, and a lot of people are doing it now, and we don't really know what they're going to do in 10 years' time. But it has a potential to really contribute a lot in the future to fertility rates. And this is really the only way, because success rates using own eggs decline with age. And this really brings you to think about reproduction in a different way, and of the contribution that ART can have to reproduction, not simply by augmenting your chances within the reproductive window, but extending this window past the age after which usually it's not possible to have children anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And regarding access, I think this really links with the topic of reproductive justice and the fact that infertility is a disease. And so if a person experiences infertility, should be able to receive treatment regardless of their socioeconomic status. And so that is really why the government should provide support for this type of treatments. And but yes, it is not the main goal should not be to increase fertility. And you tell us how to improve access in countries. I guess by adopting more comprehensive policies that allow people to use treatments regardless of their age, and for several number of treatments. We know people on average need 3 treatments, but this has to be done in a context where people are also well informed about their chances. Otherwise, the risk here is that people have this illusion that ART will solve all their problems, and they may even postpone childbearing even more because they know that there is public funding for ART, and ART is the solution, but we know it's not. And so it's really important the narrative and what the government that the government communicates this information to the potential patients. Yeah.
Thank you. And would you like me to comment?
조금 전에 그 코멘트 주신 내용 중에 난임 시술로 태어나는 아기가 200% 이상으로 된다고 그 데이터에 대한 말씀을 하셨는데요. 이 부분은 난임 시술로 태어나는 아기에 대한 데이터입니다. 2006년도에는 저희 그 우리나라에서 난임 시술을 지원에 아주 제한적이었습니다. 소득도 제한적이었고 대상도 아주 제한적이었기 때문에 적게 태어났고 2023년 즉 지난해부터는 모든 것을 확대해서 모든 난임 부부에게 지원을 확대해 줬기 때문에 이렇게 그 증가했다는 것을 말씀드리고 싶습니다. 그리고 조금 전에 루시께서 하신 말씀이 상업적 영향, 즉 난자 동결에 대한 그 상업적 영향이 문제가 될 것이라고 말씀을 주셨는데요. 맞습니다. 올해 얼마 전에 한 의료기관에서 지금 저장해, 이 말은 뭐냐 하면 합의를 이렇게 지금 저장해라는 주제를 가지고 했습니다. 현재 지금의 난자 증자가 가장 건강한 상태이기 때문에 지금 저장하고 다음에 임신을 할 때 사용을 하라는 그런 의미로 파벌을 하고 있습니다. 이런 부분에 대한 우려도 있고요. 그리고 그 난임에 대한 인식 문제를 지적해 주셨는데요. 맞습니다. 본인이 불임에 들어간다는 것을 알지 못하거나 그리고 난임 시술로 인해서 임신을 할 수 있다는 그런 가능성을 믿고 임신을 늦추는 경우가 많습니다. 저희들도 어떻게 하면 이런 인식 개선을 할까? 그에 대한 고민이 많고 해결책도 이렇게 강구하려고 노력하고 있습니다. 서울시는 이 난임 시술 대상자를 모두 이렇게 규제를 풀고 있습니다. 난임 시술을 해서 아이 갖기를 희망하는 모든 여성에게 난임 시술 지원을 하고 있습니다. 이 부분은 누구나 다 아기를 갖고 싶고 하고 경제적 이유 때문에 아기를 갖지 못한다면은 그것 또한 정책으로 지원해줘야 된다고 생각하기 때문에 모든 난임 부부에게 지원 대책을 풀어주고 있습니다. 그래서 많은 전문가들은 이에 대한 문제점을 지적하기도 하지만 우선 저출산 위기를 극복하기 위해서는 한 명이라도 더 낫게 하는 것, 아이를 낳게 하는 것도 필요하지 않는가 저는 생각합니다. 이상입니다.
Thank you so much. Actually, at this point, if the audience wants to start asking questions, it's fine with me to wake you up. But I do have many of my own, but I don't want to Do you feel like saying something or asking something immediately, or do you need more time to think? It seems like, yeah, Melinda, please.
Thank you very much. Really interesting session. I'm Melinda Mills from Oxford. I would like to ask you, you were just talking about fertility awareness and that young women weren't often aware of fertility. So I'd like to understand a bit more in the education system when, is there a discussion about that at all in terms of infertility, fertility awareness? Could you address that, or is it something that is just not in the education system at all?
Yes. So from what I know in the education system, there is a lot of sexual education, but mostly targeting, teenagers not to get pregnant if they don't want to get pregnant. But there is much less information on the other hand of the story, like how to get pregnant if you want to have a child. And of course, they are both important, but the problem of having only one of them is that people have, I think, this idea that it is really easy to get pregnant, and what you really have to worry about is how to avoid an unwanted pregnancy. And so I think they go through like the first half of their reproductive life with this idea. And then when it's finally the time that they want a child, they realize that their chances are much lower than what they thought. And I don't think there is a specific place right now in the education system where women are told about these things. And there's a lot of studies that shows that most people don't really have a good knowledge of these aspects, both men and women, also highly educated individuals, and that people tend to overestimate the chances of having a child and the ability of ART to overcome these barriers. Yeah.
How is this taught in Korea today?
지금 현재로 학생들 대상으로는 그 교육 체계가 없습니다. 올해 조금 유효한 사업을 진행했었는데요. 기업을 찾아가서 가입력 검사를 하고 지금 현재의 본인의 생식 기능 상태, 생식 나이를 알려드리는 사업을 했었습니다. 남자의 정자 테스트, 그리고 여성의 난소 나이를 알게 해서 본인의 생식 기능이 어느 정도인가를 이렇게 알게 함으로써 빠르게 그 결혼을 하고 아기를 낳아야 되겠다는 그런 인식을 갖도록 하는 그런 사업을 했습니다. 꽤 흥미롭게 성과도 좋았습니다.
Thank you. And if I may follow up, do you teach in schools? I'm sorry, I just don't know. Do you have sexual education, and do you have fertility awareness education then as part of teaching sexuality and reproduction?
네. 학교를 대상으로 하는 사업은 아니고요. 기업의 그 직장인, 미혼 남녀를 대상으로 실시한 사업입니다. 그리고 지금 저희들이 이제 사업 구상을 하고 있는 내용 중에 내년부터 교육청과 협의를 해서 생식 기능에 대한 교육안을 마련하고 어떻게 하면은 교육을 할 수 있을까, 그에 대한 협의를 하려고 하고 있습니다.
Thank you. Very interesting. I actually think the organization Jasmin was thinking about is probably the British Fertility Society. Yes, or not? NHS. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So both Sweden and Finland and Denmark and I think Australia have quite interesting programs, I think, for teaching reproductive empowerment and awareness to women, men, and in very different kinds of family constellations. If anybody from Korea is interested, Finland certainly is interested. Yeah, we do this very badly in Finland at the moment. Yes, I see a question there, please.
I'm Lazzari from Italy. I wanted to follow up on a point that Liz made in the final part of what she said. So you're saying that we as experts should use this policy top priority on rising fertility levels to bring about discourse on reproductive justice and gender equality. And I share the idea or word with you, but in practice, all these efforts in some of the countries that are very much concerned with low fertility don't really go in that direction. So my country, Italy, gender equality, the efforts are on making more generous maternity leave for mothers, not for mothers and fathers. Reproductive justice, again, Italy recently introduced a new law for making surrogacy a universal crime, so that same men, gay couples, but also heterosexual couples that try for surrogacy abroad, they can be persecuted when they go back with the child to Italy. So in principle, these are very good hopes, but in practice, how do we translate this?
Mm-hmm. Yes, very good question, and raises many of the ethical considerations which are sometimes involved. Lucy was nodding. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you, Agnieszka. Well, I think, of course, in the Italian case, including my country, I'm from the Netherlands originally, and we've just seen it in the US, the rise of the conservative populist right, which is part of many of these developments that you're describing, which positions reproduction at the heart of the political debate and often uses it to divide people or to encourage reproduction in very traditional terms, but not in other ways. What I think is just that because this is the closing session, it may be worth thinking for us as a group about the next steps and about the fact that there has been a lot of support and interest in this topic. Yesterday, we saw a lot of presence of the press, of the political representation here as well, of the large organizations represented in this room. So I think, while we are not in power in that way, we can use the power that has been generated in this room in order to make a set of recommendations that bring together maybe those more progressive goals with the idea of low fertility rates in a way that is supported by scientific evidence. So it's not necessarily an ideological intervention, but just to point out where we do see those links with all the issues we've discussed about gender equality, for example, or all the issues we've discussed about the importance of having favorable labor conditions and living conditions for people. So really using the discussions we've had and thinking about how we can communicate them and how we can use the power that we have in this room in order to nudge things in that direction is, I think, our duty.
Good. Lucy wants to write a manifesto. Are you going to time? Maybe during the dinner session. I'm in. Yes. Do you want to also comment on that question raised? No? Okay.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think one of the critical points that I think is important is that, of course, countries have the decision about how they will, what sort of laws they will put around ART. And for example, what WHO does is just we put out recommendations and then countries actually really decide what they want to do. The reason why I was asking whether a regulation is a good point is because when it's done in a wrong ideology or excessively, actually it limits access to ART. So that's exactly what's going on in Italy. But if you don't have a legal framework or some sort of regulation, what happens is that you have additional add-ons which are provided. Those are ineffective treatments that are charged to patients who pay out of pocket. And that means that people spend money out of pocket, or you have ineffective treatment which actually increase the risk of poor maternal outcomes and neonatal outcomes. So this is exactly one demonstration of where regulation can be applied in a way that limits access and limits equity in access to fertility care. That's what I wanted to comment on.
Oh, but if I just may respond to that, I don't think we should position that as a binary, though. Like, there is the question of who has access to treatment, and there's the question of how we regulate a commercialized fertility industry. But the issues that you raised about, for example, gay parenthood, surrogacy, and reproductive freedom are not the ones that are in conflict with the issues that come up with a kind of free market reproductive sector, in which we have indeed those issues with add-on technologies. So just to say it's not one or the other, we can have a progressive policy of coverage and support for ARTs, and at the same time think about how we can curb those limitations and issues with over-commercialization.
Totally, I agree. And it is true that will in many countries, it's not just one response, it's in many different responses. It can be a law, it can be a policy practice, or it can be professional recommendations and so on. Yeah. I agree.
Yes, I have a question to you in this regard. So you're being very supportive to the number of treatment cycles, and also regarding social egg freezing. And you have also been talking about the costs that for example, social egg freezing is quite important. So and with these policies in place, in a way, you're not only supporting people who need these treatments, but there's also a business, a commercial side to that, right? In a way, so there's somebody also profiting from it. I mean, it's something that we have to think about, like that's something that we have to consider, and maybe you have some thoughts on that.
네, 코멘트 주셔서 감사드리고요. 지금 남자 동결이나 이런 부분에 있어서는 대상에 대해서만 지원을 하지 기업의 비즈니스에 대해서는 지원을 하고 있지 않습니다. 그래서 실제적으로 이런 지원을 통해서 의료기관에서 대상자가 많이 늘어남으로 인해 가지고 어떤 수입적인 면에서 많이 증가를 하겠죠. 그래서 실제적으로 저희들이 보통 들어가는 예산들이 의료기관으로 모두 다 이렇게 투입되게 되는데, 의료기관에서는 환자들을 유치하려고 많은 노력을 하고 있습니다. 근데 의료기관에서도 어떤 테크닉한 문제, 그 다음에 어떤 환자 난임 시술의 성공률에 대한 문제, 이런 부분들을 많이 이렇게 효과적으로 이렇게 정진시키려고 노력을 해야 되는 부분도 있겠고요. 무조건 이제 정부 지원책이 증가함으로써 의료기관이 커진다는 그런 부정적인 시각은 좀 접어주었으면 좋겠고요. 이런 지원으로 인해 가지고 의료기관도 함께 노력해서 어떤 난임 시술자들에게 좀 더 성공률을 높이고 한 명이라도 아기가 더 낫게 하는 그런 지원이 필요하지 않을까, 그런 생각이 됩니다.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you about the future. Many of you mentioned that although there are fertility effects of ART, especially in the higher ages, our kind of primary goal is the reproductive justice, enabling people to have the numbers of children they can have. But we also know that the technological development is moving really rapidly. And there are step A is we will probably within 10 to 15 years, if I understand the experts correctly, have access to artificial gametes, which means that I could take now a cell from my body, and then I could develop that into a sperm or into an egg cell. And then I could make some other woman, if it's legal, inseminate and make some other women have my baby now. So that would change the whole game, especially for the elite, I assume, who would have access to this. And then the other thing is, of course, the artificial wombs. So I also heard last week in Vienna, in the very interesting conference on delayed reproduction, that they are also happening. The research is happening. It's being done on deer. It might be done on humans. That would mean we are really not serving. There are no parents in a way, there are genetic parents. Maybe I don't know how they will get the gametes, but this removes reproduction from the sphere of where we are now, which is like people wanting to have a child and enabling that. And I think it's quite easy to agree that kind of this we want to facilitate within ethical boundaries. But what do you think about the future of artificial reproductive technologies if it goes into these more extreme versions? How do you see the need for regulation? Maybe I would actually start with the WHO here, but start with you and because the technologies are being developed now, and I have no idea if they are regulated. And I mean, of course, they are regulated, but how will we, as a society, set the limits to them, or will we?
That's a very difficult question, really. What WHO has done over the last 1 year is looked at the application of artificial intelligence in ART. We think that's much more on the horizon, much more closer to where we are than what you've described. And we've put out some considerations for countries to think about how AI is going to be used within healthcare and within sexual reproductive health services. In terms of the application of the technologies we've described, we know that there are centers that actually do womb transplants. Baylor University, for example, is the only center that we know that does it, but it's being done for medical reasons. And I think one of the critical points that we should do as we think about this ART is to really distinguish medical application or application of ART for a clear medical need, right? As opposed to experimental and for research purposes. And I think that first, it helps to really make sure that there are stricter ethical considerations, especially when you're just doing it for research. And we've seen this growing in a way that now you can have imported mitochondria. I think there's imported mitochondria for a genetic problem. Right. So there are things that you could do because there's a medical need. And there are other things that you can do which are much more experimental. So from WHO perspective, we're right now looking at use of AI in this sector, and we think that it's likely to require some kind of considerations for countries in the near future. And I just want to add one little point on the response from Korea. I think what Korea is doing is actually the right thing, because what we support is universal health coverage. And the definition of that is people should have health care when they need it, where they need it, without incurring a cost. So last year, we published a paper in Human Reproduction Open that showed that in some countries, people spend up to 200% of their GDP on a single cycle of IVF. It's not even guaranteed, but they're spending a lot. So the funding from the government is extremely useful. And that's the reason why I asked, what was the reason why you saw that jump? And clearly the answer was eligibility was improved, funding was improved, which means there was a need, but because of lack of funding, people are not able to access it. So just a small comment to say that I think South Korea is moving in the right direction, but there are bigger questions on ethics, which I think we may not be able to respond right away, but of course, we'll hear from the rest. Thanks.
Ester.
Yeah, I think that so these are big ethical questions, and my impression is that societies are really catching up with technology here, because as you were saying, this is happening now. They are testing these things in the lab, and we're still like very behind with our policies. We're still, in the process of accepting donor eggs in some countries, and here we are talking about much more complicated and like incredible things that science can do. And I think this is a very important question, not just because we can do it, everything should be allowed, but if we think about the current treatments, then access to this treatment is already something we could work on, because there's still so many countries where it is not accessible, and I think even by simply making the current more traditional treatments more accessible, we can already see in the next few years a much bigger contribution of ART to fertility rates. Like, this potential has not been really fulfilled yet. So I believe that in the future there will be a growing increase in the contribution of ART.
Thank you. Did you, Lucy, want to comment on the future?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot of interesting issues raised at the moment. So before we go to the future, the issue of pricing, just one interesting development is called the Walking Egg Project. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but that's a variation of low-cost IVF. It's interesting to see that a lot of the new developments are aiming to what they call democratize reproductive technologies. So, for example, by requiring less labor to do the embryological work. So if that works out, one prototype is, for example, to input the egg and the sperm into a machine that does all the work that would manually be done by embryologists through robotics and various AI techniques, and then output after 3 to 5 days an embryo that's genetically tested. And there's a lot of funding that's gone into that. We don't know if it's going to happen, but they're on the way for that. So that will be in the next couple of years if it happens. So that will also mean that you can do IVF in places that doesn't have a very sophisticated embryological lab or a great amount of highly specialized people. So that would really shift things in terms of the costing and availability of IVF as well. But again, with all these things, we don't know if they will happen depending on the research. I think when it comes to government subsidies of private sector funding, what can happen is that the prices rise because the affordability limitations to the cost of a treatment are limited because of the subsidies. So we saw that in Australia, for example, where we have a highly consolidated fertility sector and a lot of government support for fertility treatments, that the prices rose because there was no limitation in terms of what people could afford to pay for it. So that's something to be aware of and to be careful about when the Korean government negotiates with the fertility clinics about what's acceptable and what isn't price-wise. In terms of IVG, so in vitro gametogenesis, so they try not to say synthetic gametes or artificial gametes, but creating eggs and sperm out of stem cells. I think 10 to 15 years is quite optimistic. At the moment, the life scientists that I were talking to are still working on the very first phases of even differentiating stem cells into very primordial versions of ovarian tissue, which then needs to be further differentiated. But it has already led to the live births of baby mice. So it is technically possible. However, to do it in mice, you have to lose a lot of mice. So you have to kill a lot of the parent mice, and there's hundreds of failed births for one effective birth. So even in a much more reproductively efficient species, it's very hard to do this. Having said that, there's now hundreds of millions of dollars of investment in private equity, in venture capital-backed startups that are trying to look into this technology to develop it. And if it does get developed, one of the other implications besides gender, so you could have possibly female sperm and male eggs, but also you could create embryos at scale. So nowadays with IVF, you have to do a lot of effort to create a few embryos, and then you can select those. But if you could create, say, 1,000 or 10,000 embryos, and you could genetically test all those embryos, you're getting to a very different level of selection you can have with reproductive technologies, and that I think will be a huge difference as well. But it depends on whether it happens, and if it is technologically possible in the future, whether we agree that it's okay. So, for example, when we look at SCNT, so the cloning technology, that's been possible for now now 20 years, but still humans are not being cloned because there's a global agreement that we don't want that to happen. And it may very well be with IVG that we have a similar agreement globally that we do not want to create children in this way. Same for artificial wombs. Probably with artificial wombs, that's again a very broad term. But what will probably happen is that earlier births are going to lead to more healthy outcomes. So if children or babies who are born at a very early stage would now not survive, these technologies may help them survive later. On the other end, you can now legally culture embryos for 14 days, and that is a legal limit. But we may also look into extending that limit. So there's a lot of discussions around the world now whether we want to extend that, which would be also required to look into that part that isn't covered by that. So if potentially embryos would be allowed to be cultured to a month or beyond that, then you get those 2 points coming closer together, which is required for that technology you're talking about.
Fascinating, thank you. We have time for one comment or question from the audience. Who still has something or the mind or in the heart? I can see no hands. Then I would like you to, I would ask the panel to conclude. And as you said, yeah, it's the last session. We may head towards the new Reproductive Justice and Fertility Manifesto. But for now, I would like you to conclude shortly. So you have like 2 sentences each, maybe 5, on a note of hope. What do you personally see in this assisted reproductive technology field as the most hopeful thing that you would like to do or that you see happening? And should we go like this in order so I don't have to say? Yeah, Jasmin?
In terms of hope, it's a good question. It's easier to think of the risks and associate with it. But in terms of hope, so I mean, these kind of treatments offer people the opportunity, the chance to have children at a later reproductive age, and we might even see, as Ester pointed out, an increase in the in an extension of the reproductive period. I mean, I'm not sure this is desirable. There's a lot of things we have to discuss, but there are chances in these in these technologies, but so there's a lot to do regarding regulation, etc.
Thank you. Ester?
So I think that on the positive side, ART is allowing people that in the past would never been able to have a child to experience parenthood and to have a child that they wish to have. I'm thinking about single people or same-sex couples or people that have infertility and in the past would not have been able to cure that. And so this is a positive impact of ART that we are only seeing really in the current society, and it was not possible before. And also, I hope that since the large majority of people using ART are really people that have postponed childbearing but may have been able to have a child without ART if they just had their children a bit younger, it could be that this increase in use of ART and all these stories that we're hearing from friends and family, they will make us think a little bit more about this mismatch between our biological window and when it is socially optimal to have a child. And now the age at which is socially preferred to have a child is like increasing. Like surveys show that people ideal age for having a child is increasing, has been increasing over time. But this really clashes with when we can have a child and when is the best age to have a child. So I hope that instead of going the direction that we make it as more medicalized as possible, we instead go the opposite way and we kind of rethink about how we organize our life and when to do things, what is the appropriate age to do things, because really for the large majority of people using these treatments, that this would solve the problem. Yeah.
Thank you. That was beautifully said. And then Mijeom, please.
저는 법적 규제를 풀어나가는 부분에 대해서 한번 말씀드리고 싶습니다. 고단위 난임자들은 대부분 수정된 배아를 이식받고 싶어 합니다. 보통 난자에 문제가 있는 그 고난이 난임자들은 많은 부분에서 실패를 경험했기 때문에 임신에 하고 남은 배아를 이식받고 싶어 하지만 지금 법적 규제로 인해 가지고 이식을 받을 수 없는 부분이 있습니다. 생명윤리 부분에서 규제를 하고 있고요. 그리고 또 한 부분은 난자 동결을 어떻게 하면 좀 더 이렇게 임신에 사용할까 하는 부분인데요. 지금 현재 우리나라는 대한민국에서는 결혼을 하지 않으면 냉동된 난자를 가지고 임신을 할 수가 없습니다. 그렇기 때문에 비혼 문제를 풀어나가야만이 냉동된 난자를 활용해서 좀 더 많은 임신을 가져가지 않을까 그런 생각이 들어서 이렇게 법적 규제를 푸는 문제에 대해서 좀 더 심도 있게 고민해야 된다고 생각합니다.
Thank you. Yes, and the equal access, very important.
I think on a positive note, ART is only going to become more mainstream. And this is because as age of maternal age is increasing, more and more people will need it. So we are in a very good place to be able to increase access and respond to what we anticipate that is going to be happening in the coming days. Number two, ART became available in 1980s. And up to now, the data we have shows that between 10 and 12 million children have already been born with ART. So we are not talking about something that was discovered yesterday. We are talking about something that's been tried in many countries, and we know the limits and the opportunity for providing it safely. I know that we've talked about technological advancements, and a lot of those actually create more questions and ethical concerns. But for what we have now, we have a technology that can be used. The question is, countries need to be able to pay for it. We need to get universal health coverage to include infertility within responses. And if we do that, it will naturally become one of the ways in which, one of the ways in which people can actually realize their reproductive rights. Thanks.
Thank you. That was so eloquently put. It could go into the manifesto, I think, like directly. Okay, please, Lucy, you have the final word.
Great, thank you very much. So I think it's great that the Korean government is covering these technologies to the extent that it limits the inequality of access to them. And it's often really important, like what kind of messages are attached to that, so that they're not a message of pressuring people, but to respecting their choices, but to have the availability is really important. I think it's also great that the current situation is opening up more possibilities for people who are not necessarily in a heterosexual married to access these technologies. So I really am glad that you're saying that, and I hope that the situation will create more accessibility to women and men all around. And linked to that, what I've also learned in the last 2 days makes me feel like the Korean women are actually in a really exciting place as well. So there's a lot of trouble, but they also sound like they're highly educated, highly articulate, a really interesting group of people that I think can be an inspiration for women around the world. And in fact, if we look at the 4B movement, we see that that's already inspiring women in the US, for example. So perhaps we've all been talking about low fertility, and that's an important issue, but we can also look at what can we learn from the women here and how can we be inspired by them as well. So I think that may be a hopeful thing for me to take away from my stay in Korea.
That was beautifully put. Yes, the Korean women and men are. Thank you all.
For women. As we come to the conclusion of today's event, I would like to extend our deepest gratitude to all speakers, panelists, and participants for their valuable contributions. To deliver our closing remarks, I would like to introduce Dr. Mijeom, Director